As we're all familiar, cybersecurity sits at the intersection of people, technology, and data, which means it's critical to make people part of your security strategies. When employees understand the problem and can be active parts of the solution, it's win-win for everyone. I'm really excited to introduce our next speakers. We have Sandeep Amar, Chief Privacy Officer at MSCI, and Martin Booth, the CISO of Euromoney. They're going to talk to us about how they're using the Tessian platform to stop data exfiltration over email.
What better way to kick it off to introduce our star-studded panel that we have here today. First up, we have Sandeep Amar, who's the Chief Privacy Officer at MSCI. MSCI provide global equity indexes and have over 3,000 employees across the world. Also, we're joined by Martin Booth. Martin is the CISO at Euromoney. Euromoney are a FTSE 250 global information services business. Both are Tessian customers, and we're really excited to have them here today. To make sure this session is as valuable as possible for all of you guys at home, you can ask questions using the Q&A widget on screen, and we'll have a team on hand to answer them. So let's kick it off. Sandeep, I know human layer security really resonates with you and the vision that you have for security. Could you speak a little bit about why you think this should be so critical to an organizational security strategy?
Of course. I guess the approach of human layer security is ultimately to focus on the errors that humans actually make. And it acknowledges that there is, there's significant human interaction with data. And it embraces the position that people are either going to be unaware of their errors or potentially reluctant to own up to them. And I think the current situation is that, human layer security operates just in time. So it actually helps to prevent an error from occurring and then empowers the user to accept that guidance, accept that advice, and ultimately correct their actions or proceed with whatever input that they want to provide, which will then help to improve the control. And over and above that, the visibility that you actually have into that interaction is also great insight for the privacy team and the security team to understand what's actually going on in their landscape. So even if there was, for example, any kind of malicious intent, and I think the objective of human layer security is obviously to detect errors. But if there actually was any malicious intent that maybe wasn't picked up by your traditional data leak protection controls, then this is something that can actually aid you in actually identifying issues that you maybe wouldn't necessarily have been aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the way that we see it, is not only empowering users, employees to make the right decision in the moment, but also actually giving privacy teams, security teams superpowers in terms of understanding when there is both malicious and also accidental activity that they should be aware of. So thanks for sharing. Do you think that with those strains, distractions, etc., there is are you seeing any increased trends in terms of accidental data loss, specifically misdirected emails, which is, I know what we've spoken a lot about in the past?
I think it's going to be a trend. I think ultimately human error is going to be increased, with distraction. That's undoubtedly going to be the case. When people are outside an office setting, then the likelihood is that they're not necessarily dealing they're not necessarily operating in exactly the same mindset. I think that's going to be the case for a lot of people. I would say that we've all probably been in this situation for roughly 6 months now. So people have probably become accustomed to working remotely, but the distractions still exist. So yeah, I think the likelihood is that with all those distractions and the constraints that people are working under, human error is definitely going to be part of the equation.
And how do you guys think about helping your employees? Obviously, it's a stressful time for a lot of people. How do you, they're taken out of the formality of an office, more distractions to make mistakes. What steps have you taken to help support them and ensure that we can reduce that burden on them?
Absolutely. So, yeah, there are a number of measures that we've taken and that I would also advocate that other organizations look to do as well. And it's all about risk mitigation. First of all, kind of training and awareness. The majority of organizations will probably have some kind of security training or privacy training that their workforce need to go through. It's about, reinforcing those messages that, people have learned parrot fashion in some cases whilst they're in the workplace, and how those can actually be applied in a different setting. Um, Alongside that, it's also about encouraging digital hygiene and data handling guidance when you're working in a remote setting. Should you, for example, be allowed to print when you're remote? Do you need to print? How do you actually, interact and work with data that is traditionally going to be managed by the ring-fenced office environment? All of those things are pretty key. And alongside that, ensuring that you've got appropriate controls and protection in place with the expanding environment that you need to protect. So endpoint protection, your foundational controls, those need to be maintained in this environment. And then also looking to see, what additional measures you can actually implement from, using technology to assist users preemptively before before someone actually drops the ball, giving them that guidance so the errors don't actually occur.
Yeah, I think two really interesting areas that you raised there, which I'd love to dig a little bit deeper on. The first is training and awareness, reevaluating policies, educating users how to deal with data in a more dispersed fashion. Do you find that people are less engaged, or I guess there's so much going on, there's so many distractions. Do you still have the attention of the user to be able to effectively train or effectively re-educate about policies, or is that increasingly difficult when they're not out of the office and not in that necessary office mindset?
Sure. I think privacy and data protection and security training has always been a challenging area. It's about finding getting to the crux of the message. What is that learning objective, and condensing it down so that you're not going to distract the user from their day job. Let's face it, not many people enjoy going through their security training, whether it's annual or quarterly or how often they actually have to do it. And there are so many other messages that need to get through, from compliance training and health and safety, and the myriad of regulations that you need to contend with. So the key thing is making sure that that message is succinct and making sure that it's relevant. And I think if you're doing both of those things, then there shouldn't be a challenge. I think in the early days of lockdown, there was certainly, I suppose, more of a challenge as people were becoming accustomed to their new working environment. Aside from their work and aside from technology, it was their new working environment, and some of the constraints that we've already touched on. It was dealing with those and then becoming comfortable with that. I think getting that training and awareness out early is something that that we did, and I think it definitely paid off, making sure that users were aware of what they needed to be doing, how they needed to be doing it, if they had any questions, who they should contact, how they should engage, and a lot of this also comes down to capacity planning for your infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the second really interesting point, the second limb that I wanted to touch on was you mentioned about trying to preemptively prevent some of these instances from happening. Let's talk about human error, for example. It's always going to be there. How can we not only train people to reduce it, but also have preemptive controls to stop it? And obviously, that's what Tessian does a lot of. I'd love to understand, what is the impact for you as a chief privacy officer of being able to preemptively stop that breach before it happens, and why is that something that is so important for yourself, but other security and privacy professionals to invest in?
Of course, yeah. I guess the key thing here is, it's a matter of closing the gates after the horse has bolted. Rather than having to do that and clean up the mess and deal with what you need to deal with, it's better to understand how your users actually work, understand their workflow, understand what is normal behavior, what is acceptable behavior, and then if they deviate from that, if they color outside the lines, then you can step in before there is actually an issue, just have that buffer, if you will, and deal with it appropriately, whether it's just coaching the user, whether it's validating, is this actually what you meant to do, maybe this is a more appropriate action, and using technology to help you do that. I think it's very advantageous.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the the impact that has on yourself and your teams, I'd love to understand like some of those. I guess you're talking about preventing that breach before closing the gate before the horse is bolted. If that horse does bolt and there are regulatory reporting obligations, there are internal reporting obligations, how do you like think about quantifying all of that time and effort and energy that you save by preemptively addressing and stopping some of these breaches? If you do, of
Sure.
course.
Well, sure, of course. So I guess for any organisation, if they are in a regulated industry, or even if they're not, there are going to be reporting obligations, depending on the scale of the incident, and there's undoubtedly going to be a degree of investigation and analysis, which is going to take resource not just from your privacy and data protection team, but from across the business. So it's likely going to involve legal. It's likely going to involve your forensics team if you've got a forensic team, so your IT security resources. There's probably going to take up some time from the actual business unit themselves. And alongside this, there's probably going to be various management escalations. So there's an awful lot of churn that would need to happen off the back of any significant incident. Obviously, if you can avoid that, there's some great efficiency gains there. But obviously, we want to try and avoid incidents occurring in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area going into the hidden cost of a breach. And what I love is how you can actually, from a security or privacy professional perspective, begin to show real positive impact that controls that you're introducing have created within the organization, whether that be made a lot of people's life a lot easier, but also, of course, prevented those breaches.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much for sharing that insight, Sandeep. Okay, so now over to you, Martin. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into data exfiltration and employees sending information home. Now, exfiltration can obviously take many different forms. I know that at Euromoney, you focus specifically on data loss over email. What process did you go through in terms of understanding that email was the risk vector that you wanted to solve first?
Well, I suppose in truth, it wasn't the one that we solved first. Actually, it's on a journey of preventing data exfiltration for us, and it's probably not the end of the journey, but it wasn't the start either. So we started with things like beginning to restrict cloud services, so people's access to things like Dropbox akin services. And then actually we stopped things like USB drives from use as well, because we were at one point about 150,000 files a month were going onto USB sticks. None of those were encrypted. They weren't asset manager or anything like that. So we've kind of been working around a loop of data exfiltration really, and email was one on there that's always been a concerning point for us. So we started to look at email after we'd done some of the easier ones, and we were working out how we could realistically put some controls in place around email data exfiltration without starting with punitive measures against people. So we wanted to be very much to start with, at least, to provide people with education and training and awareness. So that's why I guess the testing tool worked for us, because it tells people, well, we don't think you want to send this. If you think it's okay to send this email, given the acceptable use policy and the information security policy that you've all read and acknowledged, you can still send it, but we will check. And if we don't think that it should have been sent, then we will follow up with you. So I guess it's part of the whole data exfiltration piece. But email is a tricky one, because everyone needs to have a high level of flexibility with email, and I don't want to trample on people's toes with regards to email, but also we don't want to just assume that everyone's doing the right things all the time, even if they're not always doing things maliciously. Most of the things that we pick up are people that just don't understand that they shouldn't have done those things in that way.
Yeah, I think one point that you touched on there is email is such an enabler, and ultimately we hire people to do their jobs and do the best job possible. And you don't want to get into this into the situation where you're locking down access to their ability to be able to do their job, and therefore like taking a hit on the productivity of the organization, etc. When you were looking at implementing the solution, you mentioned user education, focusing on empowering the user. How did that land with users when they started, seeing warnings when we're sending sensitive information home? Like, what was the general feedback you had from users?
Well, I think there's a couple of stages for feedback. So we had a comms plan that backed up the rollout of this tool. So we said to people, within the next few weeks, we didn't want to specify a specific time. There was concern among senior management that people would start to just shift emails and start sending lots of information out just before the cutoff, as it were. So we just sent out an email saying at some point in the near future, we're going to enable some additional controls. And that control may pop up and tell you when you're sending an email that we don't think is appropriate. So that email went out to the staff, and actually we had quite a lot of feedback to suggest that we were being a bit too big brotherish, and that people weren't keen on us, the perceived notion that we were going to be looking inside their emails before they sent them to make sure that they were appropriate. So I don't know if it was a comms piece from us that we didn't quite get right, or just that it was a shift in culture that people weren't expecting and were a little bit anxious about. The truth is, when we actually rolled the tool out, we've had, I don't believe, any negative feedback from people actually receiving the alerts, and we do monitor in our security metrics for all of the senior management team how many alerts are generated, how many people are overriding them, how many times we're sending challenges based on the emails that they've sent anyway, how many times we're sending them reminders that they need to follow the AUP, how many of them we're escalating to their manager, how many of them are being escalated to me. All those things are tracked, and actually we haven't had anyone come back to us and say, this is a violation of my privacy. I don't agree with any of this. Most people, it seems, are willing to just accept it as it's an awareness piece, and if they get it wrong, then they're going to be followed up with.
Yeah, what we typically see across our customer base actually is there's always an apprehension initially of, will this be a little bit too big brothery? But actually, the reality is now that people really understand the importance of data. And even if it's not directly related to the job that you do, due to the press coverage, due to the amount of sensitive data that many of our organizations hold, employees know that they have a duty, and actually following policy is getting in the best interests of their own jobs, but also like their organization. So actually having very contextualized warnings, which are only warning when something is sensitive, often like that resonates with users because it goes, okay, yeah, actually that does make sense. I think when it can feel a bit too big brothery is when you have a rule-based system which is warning on everything, and then it feels a little bit like one size fits all, and this is just a bit of an annoyance rather than trying to solve a specific risk.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think that's probably.
Sorry, carry on.
I think that's probably true. I think the fact is that 95% of cases, people aren't trying to get information out of the organization. We have caught people that are clearly trying to ship information out of the organization using this tool. That they've sent hundreds of emails to themselves before, just before their last day, sending emails, and we've had to follow up with them quite strongly. But the vast majority of these people they get the email saying, "Why did you send this?" They explain it in the way that they think is appropriate, and sometimes they would just say quite happily, "Actually, yeah, in hindsight, it wasn't a very good idea." Your point saying that people are a bit nervous about it and it's a bit too big brothery, I think it depends on the culture of the organization. Ours has always been a very entrepreneurial organization, and the CEO is keen to retain that. That usually means people, want to be able to do what they want to do when they want to do it, and they're not massively keen on a control landscape. So it's a very difficult balance that the security team has to walk in order to make sure that we can protect the organization, but we're not treading on the liberties that the staff members have always enjoyed and are perceived to be entitled to. So it's quite a balanced line, and I think the tooling that we selected in Tessian helps us with that, because it tells, as you said, it tells the person, well, we think this is wrong. If we've got it wrong, you can send the email anyway, but we will check. And I think that's then their opportunity then to weigh it up and say, well, actually, is this something that I would want to get out, or is it not? And they can make the decision whether or not they think it's appropriate. And I think that's quite empowering for them. So that's why probably we've not had a lot of negative feedback.
Yeah, I think giving users the tools to empowering them to make the right decisions in the moment, knowing what they know about how valuable data is and where it should and shouldn't reside is really important. Martin, one thing that I think really sticks out about Euromoney's approach and how you think about solving risks is often you have a layered approach to risk mitigation. So I know with Enforcer, for example, you have several work streams off the back of some of the results that you see. I'd love for you to speak a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people tuning into this section will probably be able to learn a lot from that.
Sorry, you want to talk a bit about our kind of layered security policy?
Yeah, exactly. The workflows that you've surrounded Enforcer with, and escalation and education around it to ensure that you have a really robust approach to stemming that data loss.
Sure. So we developed a process, I guess, which is a 3 strikes process, and there's a workflow tool that we've developed that monitors that process for us. So the creation of that process, so it ingests data from Tessian, and then we send from that workflow tool emails to them to ask them to explain themselves, and then you can mark in that workflow tool whether we think it's appropriate, whether we need to escalate it, whether it's whether it needs to be an AUP reminder, so an acceptable use policy reminder. So we'll send them a link to the AUP and say, can you please refamiliarize yourself with this, because it would appear that you may not be that familiar with it. That's kind of step 1. Step 2 would be an escalation to their line manager to say, look, we've already spoken to this person. They said that they understood the acceptable use policy, but they're clearly still breaching it. Either they don't understand it, or they seem to think this is an acceptable way of working. So can you help us now with that? And then the third step is to myself, which I will then pick up with the divisional CEO, that we will then would deal with. And that's only happened twice since we've had the tool. And both of those cases have been with people trying to take data, their work data, with them effectively when they leave the organization. And both times the people have already left by the point that we've raised it. But within a few days we would have known, and then we would have taken appropriate action. We've kind of bolted on to that another process, because we had planned, or we did block web uploads as well to Dropbox, etc. But that got rolled back at the start of COVID-19, because there was some nervousness around the Information Security Steering Group, which is our steering committee for security within the business. Some nervousness there that frankly the people wouldn't be able to work very flexibly when they're at home. So we actually rolled back those blockages, and now the web uploads are dealt with in the same way that the Tessian tool is, in terms of a 3 strikes model and through the same workflows. And then those 2 workflows are built into our reporting metrics on a daily basis. So actually the senior management team can see how many we're issuing, and we show trend lines to show that ideally over time we're starting to go down, so that the people that do this habitually get picked up, realize it's wrong, stop doing it, and start using approved methods like Microsoft OneDrive, which is our approved mechanism for sharing collaboration. They will start using those instead, and actually we'll see a decline in the number of people, the number of alerts generated, then the number of people that are overriding them, then the number of people that are being warned because they've overridden them. All of that kind of trends downwards over time. So over time we can show a reduction in risk in this area.
That's super helpful and powerful. And I think, we've chatted about this in the past, but being able to show that trend down to senior management is a very, very effective way of showing that, security is relative, but if it's moving in the right direction, or you're trending down over time, then it's something that senior management can really engage and understand, and therefore kind of know that you're driving positive change within the security landscape. Martin, thank you so much for sharing some of your insights into your use of Enforcer and general views of stemming data exfiltration within Euromoney. Super, super helpful. And unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for all of those who submitted questions. Sorry we didn't get around to answering any more in detail, but we will follow up individually. Before we bring this to an end, I want to say a huge thank you to both Martin and also Sandeep for sharing your insights on both data exfiltration and also accidental data loss with us today. Very interesting perspectives and some really actionable takeaways for us to think about. And thank you to everyone at home who has tuned in to watch. Hope you found it valuable.